All right, it's about 12 o'clock. I'm sure we'll get people continuing to roll in, but welcome again to the Forestry lunch break session, everybody. Sure, most of you are revisiting at this point, but just to go over the basics, feel free to answer or ask questions in the chat box while Matt gives his talk. And look forward to a recording of this sometime next week. Otherwise, I'll just hand it over to Matt because I know he's got a lot to cover today.
All right. Thanks, Patrick. So for those of you that may be new, my name is Matt Provencher. I'm the Western Washington Stewardship Forester for the Department of Natural Resources. Available for site visits to come out to your property, not only for tree planting like what we're going to talk about today, but for all things forestry. So by all means, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email if you're interested in a site visit for your property. If you happen to be from Eastern Washington, you can see Rob Lineberger's contact information down there in the bottom left of the screen. He can help you with your Eastern Washington forestry needs. And if you happen to be looking for wildlife specific advice, Rob and I can certainly help you out with that, but we have a stewardship wildlife biologist on staff, Ken Bevis, whose contact information down there is in the bottom right, and he can certainly give you some pretty detailed information about your wildlife specific needs. So feel free to give us a call if you have any questions on anything. So today we're going to be talking about selecting and planting forest seedlings. Those pictures on the screen there are from DNR's Webster Nursery. On the left there, it's a nice sunny day. On the right there, that's actually a very cold winter day, and you can see all the ice on those seedlings there. So what they do when they have really cold winter days coming to prevent freezing and desiccation that can be caused because of that, is they actually turn on the sprinklers and actually put water on those trees to freeze them, and that actually protects them from frost damage. So that's what that picture on the right is. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to cover where to get seedlings. We're going to cover the different stock types and where you can use them, how to plant, and working with a crew. We're not really going to talk about matching species to your site. Patrick covered that on Monday. So for those of you that may not have listened in on Monday's talk, feel free to shoot me or Rob an email or a phone call if you have discussions about what species is appropriate to your site, but we're not really going to talk about that today. So when we're talking about reforestation or tree planting, there's really two ways you can get it. You can do it yourself or hiring a crew artificially, or you can do it naturally. Both of them are allowed in Washington after even age timber harvest. This presentation is mostly going to focus on the artificial side of things. You can see with natural regeneration, it can work, and I've seen it work okay in places. But a lot of times with natural regeneration, you get kind of like what that picture is on the right. That was actually a fire in Kitsap County is where that was. And you can see that a lot of Scotch broom came up, and we got a little patch of alder in the middle there that kind of fought its way through the Scotch broom. But for the most part, basically what we have going on there is a lot of brush and not necessarily a lot of trees growing up there. So with artificial regeneration, you can ensure you get trees in the ground. You can make sure the genetic stock is good. You can control the species that get planted. You can control the density that gets planted of. You can take advantage of the microsites, like planting next to some of that down woody debris in the picture on the right there. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Before moving on, quick question: how does frozen water on the trees protect the trees during freezing weather? So one of the biggest things about freezing weather can be the cold itself, but often it's the drying that can occur with that. And so what that ice does is it prevents those trees from drying out, basically, is what it's doing. So moving on with artificial regeneration. So when you're planting trees, it's a pretty critical stage. I've mentioned previously, if you've listened to my previous talks, the first few years of a tree's life are especially hard, those first 2 years in particular. the environment at soil level is pretty harsh. It can be really hot during the day. It can be pretty cool at night. Often dry, especially during the growing season. So doing some good site prep, like I've talked about in some of my other talks, is really critical. You're seeing some good site prep in the photo like this. They did some chemical applications to inhibit growth of competing vegetation. They've done some slash management, so you have plantable spots, but they've still left plenty of slash on the landscape, which is really good for reducing soil temperatures, increasing soil moistures, and providing microsites for your seedlings to survive. Remember, if you're committing to planting trees, lots of time, lots of money, lots of energy with that, and you want to do it right. So we want to pick the right trees, which we're going to talk about today. And but really, tree planting starts before you've put trees in the ground with kind of this good site prep, like what we're seeing in the picture there. So again, where do we get seedlings? So Patrick might have shown something like this on Monday. This is a seed zone map. I'm not going to get into great details about this because I think Patrick talked about it on Monday. That top link there is a link to a publication that we've put together for forest tree nurseries, mostly in Western Washington. Some of these nurseries will provide seedlings to areas in Eastern Washington, but it does focus on Western Washington. So you can go to that link there and you can find a list of forest tree nurseries. How this ties into those seed zones is when you call a nursery and you say, hey, I want 1,000 Douglas fir or 5,000 Douglas fir, cedar, whatever you're looking for. If they just say, okay, here's your price, come pick them up this day, you might not be getting seed appropriate to your site. And so when you're talking with nurseries, it should be a back and forth conversation. They should be asking you questions about the type of site you're planting in, because maybe different stock types are going to be better or worse for you. And we'll talk about that coming up here. But at the very least, you want to be making sure you're getting things from an appropriate seed zone. So make sure you're having a back and forth conversation with whatever nursery you call, whether it's ones on that list up there or whether it's ones that you may know in your neighborhood or whatever else. And if you're not getting that conversation, I would be wary about the type of tree that you're getting. So again, we're not going to talk about matching species to site because I think Patrick covered that on Monday, but we are going to talk about matching the stock type to the site. On the screen there, you have a couple of different stock types. These are the most common ones that we find. There might be a few others lying around out there, but these are the common ones that we have. The plug over there on the left is a 1-year tree, and all the rest of them are 2-year trees. And they have a lot of overlap in the sites that they may be appropriate for, but some may be better than others. And so we'll talk about each one right now. So we'll start with the plugs. Plugs are grown in a container in a greenhouse. So, styrofoam containers, basically you put the tree in a container. They have different sizes from styro 2, which would be like the small one on the left, up to styro 10 or 15, like the one over there on the right of the picture there. So you can have larger and smaller plugs. They're a 1-year tree, like I said, so they can be grown in 1 year. So for large landowners, industrial landowners, this can be good if something comes up that causes them to deviate from their harvest schedule, and all of a sudden now they're harvesting trees that they weren't planning on harvesting, and they need trees to plant because of that. Plugs can be useful for that because they can be grown a little bit quicker. They can be planted in a wide range of sites, but they can be particularly useful in some harsh sites. Think rocky sites, dry sites, things like that, because the plug is a little bit smaller than the bare root seedlings, and we'll see that coming up with the other ones. And so you don't necessarily need as big of a hole to get them in the ground. So oftentimes, if it's really rocky and you're having difficulty getting a hole for bare root seedlings, these can do really good. Dry or nutrient poor sites, these can do really good because what that plug is made of besides roots is something called vermiculite, which is kind of analogous to potting soil. So it has some nutrients in it. And so when you plant it in the ground, it has the advantage of giving that seedling some nutrients to start out. It can typically stay more moist I've been on sites, some dry sites in Pierce County where they planted a mix of bare root and plugs. And this was after 2017, 2018, when we had some dry summers, and every bare root seedling had died, but every plug that I dug up was still alive. So these can have those advantages of being able to deal with some of those harsher sites because of the vermiculite that's with them. So plug one, grown in that nursery for a year, just like the plugs, but then they're lifted out of those containers. They do a little bit of root pruning, which stimulates root growth. And then they transplant them back into a nursery bed. So outside at approximately 6 seedlings per square foot. So they give them a little bit more room. What this does is allows the tree to have a better developed root system, better caliper diameter. Caliper diameter is the diameter of the seedling right about at the root collar, kind of where I'm pointing right now. And then it allows for a better shoot growth, the foliage up there. So you kind of get a little bit more stout tree doing it this way. Cedars, hemlocks, larches, and some species of pine and true fir are propagated as plug ones. Don't necessarily ask me why. I don't know the answer to that question, but they tend to grow them as plug ones. And these can be good over a wide range of sites. So they're a pretty stout tree. Some of the harsh sites, they may be good as long as you can get the roots planted properly, because oftentimes when I've seen plug ones, they have a little bit of that vermiculite still left in them, not a lot, but a little bit. But also they can be used over a wide range of sites as well, from some of those poor ones to some of the better ones as well. So a 2.0 is kind of your standard run-of-the-mill tree. Basically, they put some seed out in a nursery bed at about 25 seedlings per square foot, and they let them grow for 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, they lift them, they put them in a bag, and they sell them to you for outplant. Because they're not handled very well, because they don't require the infrastructure of a greenhouse, they're not lifted and root pruned or anything like that, they have a relatively low cost. They're probably with the cheapest seedling or one of the cheapest seedlings that you can find. Um, but there's a trade-off with that, right? So they're cheap, but you also usually have a poor defined root system, a less developed caliper, so they're not as stout as a tree, and not necessarily the same foliar growth as you will with some of the other seedlings, right? And so that's because they basically stay for 2 years growing at 25 seedlings per square foot. So they stay very packed together for the 2 years. So they don't have a lot of growing space compared to the other one. But that's also why you can get them cheap. So because these trees don't have a well-developed root system, and not necessarily the same type of foliar growth, you can't expect them to grow as well initially as the other ones. All trees for the first year, maybe two, aren't going to grow too much. These especially so. So these are best on areas where you'll have low amounts of competing vegetation and browse, average or better sites where you've either protected them with tubes or are otherwise controlling the animals and you've done really good site prep. These may work for you. Otherwise, you probably want to try some other type of stock. So the last one that we're going to talk to about here are the 1-1s. So 1-1 is another 2-year tree, and what it means is that it's grown for its first year out in a seed bed about the same density as the 2.0s, so 25 seedlings per square foot or so. After the first year, they lift them, they do some root pruning, and then they transplant them back into the nursery bed at a wider spacing, again about 6 seedlings per square foot. So much like the plug one, the 1-1s, the root pruning stimulates root growth, and then the wider spacing gives them more room to grow, more available light, water, and nutrients. And so they put on good caliper growth and they put on good foliar growth. So at the end, even though it's a 2-year tree like a 2.0, and is grown in a field for 2 years like a 2.0, you end up with a tree that usually can be 50% or more larger, both in terms of foliar growth, root growth, caliper growth, height growth, everything, right? So all in all, a much better stout tree. The trade-off for that is going to be the cost. They cost about 30% more than a 2.0. So 2020 Webster Nursery prices, the DNR's Webster Nursery. If you were to buy under 500 2.0s, you would be paying about 68 cents a tree. If you were to buy under 500 1.1s, you'd be paying about 97 cents a tree. So like I said, about 37 cents more expensive. But the trade-off is you get a tree that's going to be able to survive infertile sites because it's got a good root system, so it has a better ability to go out and capture the nutrients that it needs. It's going to be taller with a stouter crown, so it's going to be able to withstand browse damage a lot more than those 2.0s will. It's going to be able to compete with vegetation already on the site because of its height and because of the roots that it has. So it has a better chance to survive those things. So if you're not sure that you would be able necessarily to keep up with browse damage or vegetation coming up on the site, you really want to consider a 1.1 as opposed to a 2.0. When we see planting failures, there's a couple of reasons they may occur. Unsuitable or poor quality planting stock. So you want to make sure that you're getting good quality stock from a nursery, and you want to make sure you're getting it from the right seed zone. So that's why it's critical to make sure you're having a two-way conversation with the nursery and that they're asking you questions as well to make sure that it gets that you get the right tree. Improper handling and storage, we're going to talk about that on the next slide. Competition for light and water by surrounding vegetation. So I've given talks on that concept alone, right? The need for vegetation management. It can be really brutal on trees, especially those first couple of years. And then animal damage. We're not only talking about deer and elk. If you're trying to afforest old fields, sometimes you can have problems with mice or voles or rabbits that like to girdle trees. If you're planting near streams with beavers as they get larger, sometimes you end up with beaver damage. So there's all sorts of animal stuff that can go on more than just deer and elk browsing your trees. Thinking about seedling care, the first thing is, when do we plant? So the planting season in Western Washington is now. So we usually start sometime in December and we go into early spring. Maybe March is best, depending on the year. Sometimes you can get into April. We start seeing increased mortality in our plantings as we get into April. If you're in high elevations or in Eastern Washington, you may be looking at April, May, and June as your planting window because of snow. But in the lowlands of Western Washington, normally we don't have a problem. So when the trees are dormant is the best time to be planting them, and that's now through early spring. Protecting them from physical damage is important. Think of these seedlings as having a bank account, much like what you have. And when they're in the ground, they have access to water and nutrients. So when they uptake those, they are adding to their account. They are crediting the account. When they don't, they are spending from their account. It's just debiting from the account. So when we lift seedlings from a nursery, they no longer have access to water and nutrients, so they can't add to the account. So everything that is happening to them at that point is a debit, is a removal from their account. So the lifting, the packing, the storing, the moving, the handling, all remove from their account. And just like your bank account, if you have too much removals and not enough coming in, you run out, right? So we want to handle these trees as little as possible. We don't want to stack planting boxes or bags up too high. We want to really try to pamper them and be gentle and protect them from physical damage. The keeping cool and moist is really critical as well. The goal is to try to keep these trees dormant and keep the roots moist. If the roots have dried out, you're going to be planting a nice looking green tree, but with dry roots, the roots are basically dead at that point. And as they come out of dormancy, they're essentially going to die because they can't uptake nutrients. So keeping them cool and moist, picking up only what you can plant at a time, those are all really important. Those links go to publications where you can get information on planting forest seedlings and maintaining seedling vigor from the Webster Forest Nursery. If you just Google DNR Webster Forest Nursery, you can find those publications on their website. So lots of ways to plant a tree incorrectly, but there's only one way to plant a tree correctly. So bottom right, there's a good properly planted tree, just about at the root collar. All the roots are in the ground. They're nicely spread out. That tree's nice and happy. The three most common planting errors we see are trees planted too shallow in the L roots and the J roots. If you are hiring a contractor, you know, a lot of these other things, the too deep, the too shallow, the not vertical, you can tug on a tree and see if it's too loose. You can see some of those. The L roots and the J roots are hard to see unless you're digging up trees. So I spent a lot of time when I was a state lands forester doing planting compliance with contract crews, and my whole job was to dig up trees looking for some of these planting mistakes. You're always going to have some, right? Nobody's perfect, but really you should have 95, 96% of the properly planted trees down here in the bottom left, and about 4 to 5% of all of these combined. And if you have more than 4 or 5% issues, then they're really not doing a good job for you. So it might be best to work with a consulting forester if you're interested, or if you're doing a lot of tree planting, or if you don't have the ability to do the compliance yourself, because you're really setting your stand up for success or failure at this point. And like I said, some of the planting issues like L rooting and J rooting, they may look like a properly planted tree just by walking by it. So you have to do some digging up and some compliance to see how they're actually doing. Here are some common tools to get the job done. On the right there, those are your common planting shovels. Those are good all-around tools for most sites. You can see it's a long, narrow spade, so the goal is to get a relatively narrow, deep hole so that you can get those roots nice and spread out down there. On the left, I call that a dibble bar. A lot of people might call it a planting bar. That thing is really heavy, and its goal is to get in through some of those more harsher sites, the compacted sites, the rocky sites, where those planting shovels really struggle. There's some other types of planting hoes or spades that kind of look like your normal garden hoe, but maybe with a blade more like what you see in those planting shovels. And if we have a sec here, we'll show that video with some. That's what the planters are using. And then finally, if you're choosing a contractor, there's a good publication from OSU on how to choose a planting contractor. If you just Google OSU, choose a planting contractor, you'll probably find it. Some questions to ask: what are their qualifications? So do they have a degree in forestry? Don't let that be a deal breaker if they don't. A lot of tree planting and that type of work is really more of a how long have you done it, who have you done it for, than do you have a degree in forestry, right? But you know, it might be good if they do. How long have they been doing it, and the types of clients are, like I said, are more important. Have they worked for industry, small landowners, nonprofits, you know, things like that. So try to see how long they've been doing the work and the variety of clients they've done it in. You can check L&I's website here in forestry or in Washington to look for claims against bonds or any dings against their license to see if they've done good quality work in the past. Talk about the tasks to be performed. So are they going to be responsible for picking up and storing trees? Are they going to need to scalp? Scalp means that there's a lot of brush or vegetation or slash on the surface, and they need to remove that before they can get down to the bare dirt to plant trees. Remember, we're planting trees in dirt, not slash. When are we going to plant the trees? Are you going to have animal browse protection like tubes? All these things factor into the next topic, which is how you're going to pay them. Are you paying per the acre, by the day, by the tree? And how much you're going to pay regardless of how you're paying them is really highly dependent on your job. So all those tasks we just talked about, but how much slash and brush? Because not only do they have to remove it, they have to walk through it. So that's going to slow their productivity. How accessible is it? How steep is it, or flat is it? All those factor into your payment. So just because your neighbor got one price and you get a different price doesn't mean you're getting a bad deal, depending on how your site is. And then contracts, right? So contracts, we always recommend contracts so that it may be your only recourse if things go sideways. Maybe if you're only planting an acre or two, you can get away with a handshake, but certainly if you're planting a lot of acres, you really want to consider a contract. In Washington, if you're looking for a tree planter, that link down there is how you can find one. That's WSU's consulting forestry directory. On top of finding consulting foresters, you can find silvicultural contractors like tree planters on there as well. So if you're looking for a tree planter, that's a good place to go. So in summary here, and then we'll watch about 30 or 45 seconds of a video of some tree planters in action. Make sure you're sourcing trees from the proper location, match species and stock type to the site with the information we talked about today, along with the information Patrick talked about on Monday. Ensure your trees are planted properly. Do everything you can to reduce stress. You know, we didn't talk about that too much because I gave a talk on vegetation management yesterday, but reducing stress on the seedlings is a great way to ensure seedling survival. And remember, you can't just walk away. There's all sorts of things that happen after you've planted trees that you need to keep an eye out on. You know, and with that, there's our contact information again. And let me bring up this video here, and we'll just watch a few minutes of it. So this guy jumps around a lot, but we'll kind of look through it here. So that's scalping, and then there he puts his hoe in the ground and he digs a hole. So if you watch this guy right here, scalps, that's the first thing he's doing. See, he's going to get to one here real soon. That's good. Unfortunately, this guy jumps around a lot. So there's the scalping. There's the hole that he's digging. There's the scalping. There's the hole that he digs right there. There's the tree that goes in the ground. You can see it was a plug, so they're pretty easy to plant. He used that hoe to push the dirt back together, to push the hole back together there, and then they move on to the next one. These guys move very fast. If you have a lot of acres to plant, I highly recommend using a consulting forester because you really need to stay on these guys. If you have 40 acres of ground, it's highly possible they plant that in a day. So you really want to be watching and making sure that you're on top of them to correct any problems, because you see just how fast they're moving. Again, so the first swing is a scalp. Let's see if he's going to watch this guy. First swing, there's a scalp. And then the next swing there is the hole. Tree goes in the ground, and then they're off to the next one. So
Hey, Matt.
really, that's as fast as it goes. Yeah.
I don't know if this is the case for everyone else, but for me, it was like there was some pretty serious gaps in the footage. It was just getting like a new frame every 2 seconds or so. So I don't know if that's the case for anybody else, but maybe you could put that link in the chat box so people could watch it afterwards.
Yeah, let me go ahead and get that if people are interested in that while we're talking here. So there's the YouTube video to that if it was coming up choppy for anybody. It is very hard to do video via Zoom.
Yeah, it is.
But anyways, remember when you're watching that, you're going to see them take one swing. That's the scalp, right? So that is clearing the area of the vegetation in the slash that they're planting in bare dirt. Then their second swing is making the hole, and they have some pretty good ground. So it's basically one swing, get rid of the duff, second swing, make a hole, tree in the ground, moving on. You don't always get that lucky. That's what I got.
Great. Yeah. And one thing Matt and I were discussing before we started is one of these days, hopefully soon, we'll be able to get Matt and I will be able to do a proper tree planting video that we can share with y'all. We couldn't get our hands on any trees right now to do that, but sometime down the line, we'll have to do an extension DNR video on proper tree planting. So, is there any questions? I don't think we missed any in the chat box. It's pretty quiet today. Let's see here. Yeah, it doesn't look like there's any questions. So, unless people want to type anything in last second there, thanks again for joining us. And we will see you tomorrow with Dan Omdahl talking about forest health, or seedling health regarding diseases and insects. So, all right, we'll see you tomorrow.
All right, thanks everybody.